The roar of the iron Vultures' motorcycles echoed through the deserted streets of a small Texas town. The biker gang moved in formation, a line of shadowed figures cutting through the hot asphalt, led by Connor Raven Hayes. His sharp eyes, hardened by years of bad decisions and unspoken regrets, scanned the road ahead. The heat of the late afternoon hung heavy, making everything feel slower. But then, a sound broke through the rumble of the engines. Faint, almost human. A whimper. "Stop!" Connor barked, raising his fist in the air. The line of motorcycles skidded to a halt, their engines sputtering into silence. The sudden stillness was eerie. There, in the middle of the cracked road, lay a German shepherd motionless. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, and streaks of blood matted its tan and black fur. Connor swung off his bike and approached cautiously, his normally stone-cold face softening just enough to betray his concern. As he got closer, his eyes caught the unmistakable lettering on the dog's black vest. K9 unit. This wasn't just any dog. This was Duke, a police K9, and something was terribly wrong. Duke looked up at Connor, his eyes filled with pain but also something else. Resolve. The dog struggled to lift his head, as though he still had a mission to complete. Connor crouched next to him, running a hand over the collar wrapped around Duke's thick neck. That's when he noticed the small camera attached to it, the red light still blinking. Without a word, Connor pressed the button to review the footage. The video was shaky, chaotic. Duke was running alongside a police car, his handler in the driver's seat. The sound of gunfire erupted as a black sedan swerved across the frame, men with masks leaning out of the windows, shooting. The handler shouted commands to Duke, who darted toward the action with fearless determination. Then the screen jolted violently before the feed abruptly ended. Connor's stomach tightened. Something awful had gone down, and now Duke was the only one left. "Where's your partner, boy?" Connor muttered under his breath. Duke whimpered, his eyes locked on Connor's as though pleading for help. In the distance, the rising wail of sirens broke the heavy silence. Rick, one of the gang's senior members, shouted from his bike. "Raven, cops are coming. We need to get the hell out of here. Last thing we need is them thinking we had anything to do with this." Connor didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on Duke, and in that moment, he felt a pull he hadn't felt in years. A sense of responsibility, a refusal to abandon something that needed saving. But staying meant more than just dealing with the police. It meant stepping into a mess he didn't understand, one that could blow up in his face. With the flash of blue lights appearing at the end of the street, Connor made a choice, one that would alter the course of his life forever. The sirens grew louder, the flashes of blue and red light bouncing off the cracked pavement. Connor stood frozen for a moment, Duke's labored breathing filling the tense air. Rick revved his bike impatiently. "Raven, we don't have time for this. If they find us here, it's over." The rest of the gang shifted nervously, some muttering under their breath, others glancing back toward the approaching cop cars. But Connor didn't flinch. His focus was entirely on the injured K9. "Rick," he growled, without turning his head, "get the van ready." Rick's eyes widened in disbelief. "The van? You've got to be kidding me. This ain't our fight." But Connor shot him a look, the kind that silenced any argument. "Now," he barked. Reluctantly, Rick peeled off down a side street to retrieve the gang's van, which they used for hauling gear on longer trips. Connor leaned down to Duke, placing a hand gently on the dog's head. "Hang in there, buddy. I've got you." The gang watched in stunned silence as Connor carefully scooped Duke into his arms. The dog whimpered softly, his weight heavy against Connor's chest. It had been years since Connor had held anything so fragile. The dog's blood soaked into his leather vest, but he didn't care. Duke's eyes fluttered open for a moment, locking onto Connor's face with a mix of trust and desperation. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Connor murmured, his voice unusually soft. The wail of sirens jolted him back to reality. 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt just down the street, their doors flying open as officers stepped out, weapons drawn. "Freeze!" One of them shouted, his gun aimed directly at Connor. "Put the dog down and step away." For a split second, Connor considered surrendering. But then he remembered the footage on Duke's camera. Something about it didn't sit right. Whoever had ambushed Duke and his handler wasn't just after a random target. This was planned. And if those men were still out there, Duke was the only one who could lead them to the truth. The sound of screeching tires cut through the standoff. Rick roared back onto the street in the gang's beat-up black van, the back doors swinging open. "Let's go, Raven." Connor didn't hesitate. With Duke cradled tightly in his arms, he sprinted toward the van as shouts erupted behind him. Bullets ricocheted off the pavement, but Connor didn't stop. He dove into the van just as Rick slammed on the gas, the tires squealing as they sped off into the night. In the back of the van, Connor cradled Duke, his mind racing. He had just made himself a fugitive, and for what? But deep down, he knew there was no turning back now. Whatever had happened to Duke, Connor was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The van barreled down a desolate highway, the roar of the engine drowning out the tense silence inside. Rick gripped the steering wheel tightly, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. "Raven, what the hell were you thinking?" he snapped, his voice tinged with frustration and fear. In the back, Connor sat with his back against the van wall, cradling Duke, whose breathing was still shallow but steady. Connor ignored Rick's outburst, his mind too focused on the battered dog in his arms and the implications of what he had just done. "Look at us now," Rick continued, slamming the wheel. "We're fugitives, with a bleeding cop dog in the back of our van. They'll have the entire state on our tails by morning." Connor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a closer look at Duke's camera, still in his hand. It was scratched but intact, and the footage from earlier replayed in his mind. The chaos, the gunshots, the masked men. It all felt deliberate, as if someone had wanted that officer and Duke out of the way. "This isn't just about the dog," Connor finally said, his voice low. "Something bigger's going on here." Rick scoffed. "Bigger? That's not our problem, Raven. We've got enough on our plate without dragging the cops and some criminal gang into it." But Connor's gaze hardened as he met Rick's in the mirror. "It is now," he said firmly. "This dog's partner is either dead or missing. And if those men come back to finish the job, they're not going to stop with him." Duke let out a weak whimper, as if to punctuate Connor's words. The sound silenced Rick for a moment, but his jaw clenched in frustration. The van turned off the main road and onto an old dirt path that led to the gang's secluded garage, hidden in the woods. The hideout was a ramshackle building used for repairs, meetings, and, when necessary, laying low. As the van rolled to a stop, Connor shouted to the others, "Get the med kit and some water." The gang scrambled out, still unsure of what to make of the situation. Duke's body trembled as Connor carefully laid him down on a makeshift cot inside the garage. "Easy, boy. You're safe now," he whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure if it was true. As the gang gathered around, Rick finally lost his temper. "You're out of your mind, Raven. Do you even know what you've done? We're criminals now, and for what? A dog?" Connor straightened, his eyes locking with Rick's. "Not just a dog. Duke is evidence. Whatever's on this camera might explain why his partner's gone, why he's bleeding in the middle of the road, and who the hell those men were." He paused, his voice dropping to a near growl. "You want to walk away? Go ahead. But I'm not leaving this unfinished." The garage fell into uneasy silence as the weight of Connor's words settled over the group. Outside, the forest was dark and quiet, but Connor could feel the storm brewing. Whoever was after Duke wouldn't stop until they found him. And now, Connor and his gang were directly in their crosshairs. The stillness of the garage didn't last long. Outside, the distant hum of an engine broke through the quiet night. Connor froze, his eyes darting toward the open door. The sound grew louder, rumbling through the trees like an approaching storm. "Rick," Connor said in a low voice, "kill the lights. Now." Rick hesitated but nodded, flicking a switch on the wall. The dim, flickering bulbs above them went out, plunging the garage into darkness. The gang scattered, each of them instinctively grabbing whatever weapons were within reach. A crowbar, a wrench, even a rusty old shotgun from a corner shelf. Connor crouched next to Duke, who was now lying more alert, his ears twitching at the approaching noise. "Stay quiet, boy," Connor whispered, his hand resting protectively on the dog's neck. For a moment, all that could be heard was the rustling of leaves outside and the slow, steady hum of an engine idling nearby. A beam of light suddenly cut through the darkness, sweeping across the garage windows. The gang held their breath as the vehicle came to a stop just beyond the tree line. Connor could make out the shape of a black SUV, its engine purring ominously. The same kind of vehicle he'd seen in the footage on Duke's camera. His stomach churned. This wasn't a coincidence. They'd been found. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, his silhouette tall and broad in the moonlight. Another door opened, then another. 3 figures emerged, all wearing dark clothing and moving with practiced precision. Connor's instincts kicked in. These weren't cops. These were the same men who had ambushed Duke's handler, professionals. He glanced back at Rick, who was gripping a tire iron so tightly his knuckles were white. "Get ready," Connor mouthed silently. A voice called out from the darkness. "We know you're in there. Just hand over the dog and we'll leave. No one has to get hurt." The voice was calm, almost casual, but it carried a cold edge that sent a shiver down Connor's spine. He leaned closer to Duke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're not here to negotiate, boy. They're here to finish what they started." Connor stood slowly, his eyes narrowing as he prepared for the fight of his life. In the stillness, the gang braced themselves for whatever came next. Outside, the men moved closer, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. The storm had arrived, and Connor knew there was no turning back. It was them or the truth, and Connor wasn't ready to give up either. The crunch of boots on gravel echoed louder with each step as the men outside closed in. Inside the garage, Connor's grip tightened on the crowbar he had grabbed from a workbench. His mind raced, calculating their options. They were outnumbered and outgunned, that much was clear. But Connor wasn't the type to roll over, especially not for men like these. Duke let out a low growl, his ears pinned back as he tried to push himself up. "Easy, boy," Connor whispered. "We've got this." Though his words sounded confident, a knot of doubt twisted in his gut. Rick crouched by the window, peering out through a crack in the boards. "3 of them," he whispered. "Maybe more. Armed." Connor nodded, already expecting as much. These weren't amateurs, their movements were too precise, their approach too calculated. One of the men outside called out again, his voice cutting through the tense air. "You've got 30 seconds to make this easy. Hand over the dog, and we'll walk away." His tone was deceptively calm, but Connor didn't buy it for a second. "Yeah, right," Rick muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "They're just gonna walk away." "Sure." Connor shot him a glare to keep quiet, then looked at the gang. "Here's the plan," he said in a low, firm voice. "We keep them outside. Use the shadows. We know this place, they don't." He turned to Rick. "You take the left side. Quiet. Don't give them a clean shot." Then he glanced at the others. "Stay low, stay sharp. We hit first." The gang shifted nervously, their breaths shallow. Connor crouched beside Duke, giving the dog a reassuring pat. "Hang tight, buddy. This is gonna get messy." The dog's eyes stayed locked on Connor, as if he understood every word. Outside, the 30 seconds had passed. "Time's up," the voice yelled, and with that, a bright flash exploded through the window, followed by the deafening bang of a stun grenade. The world tilted for a moment as the gang scrambled to recover. Connor's ears rang, but he forced himself to move, instinct taking over. The men outside were making their move, footsteps pounding against the ground as they approached the doors. Connor gritted his teeth, gripping the crowbar tightly. "Now!" he shouted, and the gang sprang into action. The first man through the door never saw the wrench coming, Rick's swing landing with a sickening crack. But the others weren't far behind, and as chaos erupted in the garage, Connor realized they were in for the fight of their lives. Amid the chaos, Duke let out a fierce bark, his strength seemingly returning, as if he knew the battle wasn't just about survival. It was about justice. Connor glanced at him briefly, determination blazing in his eyes. No matter what happened, he wasn't going to let these men win. The garage was plunged into a suffocating tension as the attackers pushed their way inside. Connor stood firm, his heart pounding in his chest as he took in the figures stepping through the door. They moved deliberately, their dark clothing blending with the shadows, their faces obscured by the dim light from the street lamps outside. "Stay calm, everyone," Connor said under his breath to his crew, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "We know this place. Use it." Duke let out a low growl from his spot on the cot, his instincts kicking in despite his injuries. Connor crouched by the dog for just a moment, placing a steadying hand on his head. "We're not gonna let them take you, boy," he whispered. His eyes darted back to Rick, who was inching toward the side of the room, staying hidden behind stacks of tools and equipment. Connor gave a slight nod, a silent signal that it was time to act. Rick grabbed an empty metal toolbox and deliberately knocked it off a workbench. The loud crash reverberated through the garage, startling the intruders and throwing them off balance. The distraction gave the gang a crucial few seconds to reposition themselves. Connor stepped out of the shadows and spoke with calm authority, his hands raised slightly. "You've got no business here. Turn around and leave. We don't want trouble." One of the intruders, a tall man who seemed to be their leader, took a step forward. His face remained unreadable, but his tone was sharp. "We're here for the dog. That's it. You hand him over and we're gone." His words hung in the air like a threat, but Connor didn't waver. "This dog's already been through enough," Connor said firmly, his eyes narrowing. "And I don't trust you to keep your word." The man hesitated for a moment, sensing Connor's resolve. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Finally, the leader motioned to his team, and they began backing toward the door. "This isn't over," the man said coldly. "We'll be back." Connor stood still until they disappeared into the darkness beyond the trees, his entire body taut with unease. He knew they weren't retreating for good. They were regrouping. As the gang regrouped themselves, Duke let out a faint whine, and Connor knelt by his side. "We bought ourselves some time, buddy," he murmured. "But we need answers, and we need them fast." The weight of what had just happened settled heavily on everyone. This was no random encounter. Duke was at the center of something much bigger, and the clock was ticking. The tension in the garage lingered like a thick fog, suffocating and heavy. Connor sat beside Duke, running a hand over the dog's fur. Duke had calmed slightly but was still weak, his breathing uneven. The rest of the gang gathered in a loose circle, their faces grim. Rick, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, broke the silence. "You think they'll be back?" he asked, though the answer was clear to everyone. Connor didn't look up. His focus was on the dog's collar, where the camera was still intact. "They're not done," he muttered, fiddling with the small device. "They came for him once, and they'll come again. But we need to figure out why. Whatever's on this camera is the key." He plugged the camera into an old laptop they kept in the garage, the screen flickering to life. As the gang crowded around, Connor replayed the footage. The grainy video started the same as before. Duke running alongside the police car, the handler shouting commands. The black sedan appeared again, weaving dangerously close, the masked men leaning out of the windows. But this time, Connor slowed the footage and caught something he hadn't noticed earlier, the license plate of the sedan, partially visible in a brief frame. "There," he said, pausing the video. "We've got a lead." Rick leaned over, squinting at the screen. "So what? You think the cops will help us with that?" "We're not exactly on speaking terms with the law." Connor's jaw tightened as he considered the next move. "We don't need the cops," he said. "We'll run it ourselves. I know someone who can trace this plate." He glanced at the group. "If we can figure out who these guys are, we'll know what they're after, and why they're willing to risk everything for Duke." The gang exchanged uneasy looks. This was way beyond their usual scope of trouble, and everyone knew it. But no one voiced their doubts. Connor pushed back from the laptop and grabbed his jacket. "Rick, You're with me. The rest of you stay here and keep an eye on Duke. No one gets in, no one gets out. Got it?" As Rick nodded reluctantly, Connor glanced down at Duke one last time. "Hang in there, boy. We're not letting them win." As Connor and Rick left the garage and headed into the night, the weight of what they were about to uncover hung heavy in the air. Whatever secrets that license plate held, they were sure to pull them deeper into a dangerous web, and there was no turning back now. The rumble of Rick's truck echoed on the empty road as Connor stared out the window, his mind racing. The laptop with the footage and the partial license plate rested on the seat between them. "Who's this guy you're taking us to?" Rick asked, breaking the silence. His tone was wary, but there was a tinge of curiosity. "Someone I used to know," Connor replied curtly, not taking his eyes off the road. "A tech guy. He used to help me with, let's just say, less than legal jobs back in the day. If anyone can trace that plate without questions, it's him." Rick grunted, clearly unimpressed. "Great. Another sketchy character. Just what we need." Connor shot him a sideways glance but said nothing. He didn't have the energy to argue. Every second they spent chasing answers felt like another second closer to danger. Duke was still back at the garage, injured and vulnerable. Those men would come back for him, Connor was certain of it. And the only way to stop them was to get ahead of whatever game they were playing. An hour later, the truck pulled up to a small, run-down shop on the outskirts of town. The flickering neon sign above the door read, "Gizmo's Repairs," though most of the windows were boarded up, and the building looked abandoned. "This the place?" Rick asked skeptically, glancing around the deserted street. Connor nodded and stepped out of the truck, clutching the laptop. "Stay sharp," he said, as they approached the door. Inside, the air smelled of burnt circuits and dust. The shop was cluttered with old monitors, broken hard drives, and wires that hung from the ceiling like a spider's web. A wiry man with thick glasses and disheveled hair looked up from a desk in the corner. "Connor Hayes," he said, smirking. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." "Gizmo," Connor said flatly. "I need your help." He placed the laptop on the desk and slid it toward him. Gizmo raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Instead, he booted up a nearby computer and started typing rapidly. As Gizmo worked, the tension in the room grew thicker. "This plate," Connor said, pointing to the screen, "belongs to a black sedan. A group of masked men used it to ambush a K-9 unit. The dog survived, but the handler's missing. I need to know who they are." Gizmo let out a low whistle, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "You don't do simple favors, do you?" he muttered. After a few tense minutes, he leaned back in his chair and adjusted his glasses. "Got something," he said. "The plate's registered to a shell company, nothing unusual there. But the address tied to it." He turned the screen toward Connor and Rick, his expression grim. "It's a warehouse about 2 towns over. Not exactly a friendly neighborhood." Connor stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. This was it, the lead they needed. But as the pieces started coming together, a sense of dread settled over him. Whatever was waiting at that warehouse wasn't going to let them walk in and out easily, and they were running out of time to prepare. The drive to the warehouse stretched in tense silence, with only the low hum of the truck engine filling the void. Connor stared ahead, his mind running through every possible scenario. Next to him, Rick was gripping the steering wheel tightly, the tension clear in his rigid posture. "You know we're probably walking straight into their trap, right?" Rick finally said, his voice edged with frustration. Connor glanced over briefly. "Yeah," he replied quietly, his voice steady. "But if they wanted Duke, there's a reason. And we're not turning back until we know what it is." When they reached the edge of the industrial district, the truck rolled to a stop just shy of the address Gizmo had given them. The warehouse loomed in the distance like a ghost, its metal walls rusted and dented, the faint glow of yellow floodlights spilling out from inside. A chain-link fence circled the perimeter, topped with barbed wire, and a few security cameras were mounted near the entrance. "Looks quiet," Rick muttered, squinting at the building. "Too quiet." Connor nodded in agreement. "Stay sharp. We're not dealing with amateurs." Using the cover of darkness, the two crept along the fence, keeping low and avoiding the cameras. Rick pulled out a pair of bolt cutters from the truck bed and made quick work of the lock securing a side gate. The chain clattered softly as it fell, and they slipped through, moving silently toward the warehouse. As they approached, Connor could hear faint voices inside, muffled, but calm. They weren't expecting trouble. Not yet. Inside, the warehouse was cavernous, the air stale and thick with the smell of oil and rust. Rows of crates and shelves created a maze of shadows, and the faint hum of machinery reverberated through the space. Connor led the way, his steps careful and deliberate. As they rounded a corner, a faint glow drew their attention. A table near the back of the warehouse, lit by a single bulb hanging overhead. Papers and equipment were scattered across it, along with a series of monitors displaying live camera feeds. "Looks like we found their nerve center," Rick muttered, his voice low. Connor sifted through the papers on the table, his chest tightening as he pieced together the evidence. Maps of police patrol routes, lists of names, and photos of officers, including Duke's handler, were laid out in chilling detail. "They've been tracking the unit," Connor said, holding up one of the photos. This wasn't random. They knew exactly who they were targeting. Rick frowned, glancing over his shoulder nervously. "Yeah, well, I'm guessing they know we're here now, too." His words were punctuated by the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the warehouse. Connor tensed, turning toward the noise. From the shadows, multiple figures emerged, their faces hard and expressionless, and weapons glinting faintly in the dim light. "Well," a deep voice called out from the darkness, smooth and commanding. "You've certainly got guts showing up here, but now you've seen too much." Connor's jaw tightened as he stepped forward slightly, shielding Rick. They were outnumbered, and there was no easy way out. But Connor wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not when they were so close to uncovering the truth behind Duke's tragic story. Connor's breath slowed as the figures stepped closer, their faces barely illuminated by the faint glow of the overhead light. At least 6 men now stood in a loose semicircle, their leader at the center. A tall, clean-cut man in a dark jacket. His eyes were cold, calculating, and he carried himself with an air of authority that sent a chill through Connor's spine. "You should have stayed out of this," the man said calmly, his voice carrying over the quiet hum of machinery. "But I guess you're too stubborn for your own good." Connor didn't flinch. He stepped forward, keeping his tone steady. "We're not leaving until we get answers. Why were you tracking Duke's handler? And why go after a K9 unit? What are you hiding?" The man smirked, shaking his head. "You really think you're in a position to demand anything? That dog is a liability. He knows too much, just like you now do. His handler? He got too close to something he shouldn't have." Connor's jaw clenched as he took in the implications. "You ambushed him," he said, the words sharp. "And you left him for dead." The leader shrugged, his tone eerily casual. "We do what's necessary to protect our interests. The handler made his choice, and now you've made yours." He gave a subtle nod, and the men around him moved forward, their steps deliberate. Connor's heart pounded, but his mind was clear. "Rick," he said under his breath, "get ready." Rick nodded, his hand tightening around the crowbar he had been holding. Before the men could close the gap, Connor acted. Grabbing a nearby crate, he shoved it hard into one of the approaching men, knocking him off balance. The sound of the crate crashing to the floor echoed through the warehouse, breaking the tension. Rick swung his crowbar, catching another attacker off guard as chaos erupted. Connor's focus, however, wasn't on the fight. It was on the table of evidence. He grabbed the stack of documents, shoving them into a backpack he had brought. These papers were the proof they needed to expose whatever this group was hiding. Connor and Rick moved fast, dodging and weaving through the maze of crates as the men shouted orders and gave chase. As they reached the exit, Connor glanced back, his gaze meeting the leader's icy stare one last time. "This isn't over," the man shouted, but Connor didn't respond. He and Rick bolted through the gate and back to the truck, the sound of angry voices fading as they sped off into the night. As the truck roared down the empty highway, Connor looked at the stack of papers in the passenger seat. "We've got them," he said quietly, his voice filled with both relief and determination. Duke's story wasn't over yet, but now they had the tools to make sure justice would be served. And for the first time, Connor felt like they were finally one step ahead of the storm.